Here's why it's your fault that your kid is using weed. It's because you've been going about it all wrong. I completely get it. It's your house, it's your rules, and if your kid's smoking weed in the house and you don't like it, you've tried to punish them, you've tried to discipline them, they still won't change. Well, I have to tell you, my friend, it's still your fault. As a fellow parent, I'm gonna break it down for you what you're doing wrong in this video. Now, if you're someone that has tried to tell their kid, hey, you can't be smoking weed in the house, or you're underage, you shouldn't be doing this is bad for you, you're not gonna make anything out of yourself in life, you're gonna be a failure, a loser, and you're making them feel like this, and you think that that's somehow going to change their behavior, and it hasn't, and you're surprised about that, buckle up, buddy, because I'm about to tell you the real truth on how you can actually approach this conversation better. Here's the main reason why you're going about it all wrong. You got to meet your kid where they're at, rather than trying to impose that they do things your way. Especially if you have a teenager, there's no way in hell they're going to be listening to you if you're going to come with that kind of authority. More or less, they're going to try to rebel. Now, unless your whole thing is, I'm going to kick you out of the house if you don't change this habit, fine. If that's the way it works for you, good luck. But for the person that's still watching and doesn't want to do that, I want to give you a different approach. The approach is you got to meet your kid where he's at. And what that means is you have to approach this whole discussion with an open mind. You've tried whatever it is that you did in the past. You've had those conversations which never ended well. You're yelling at each other. Nothing gets resolved. But maybe you should try a different approach. Here's a very simple technique. First off, since this is a sensitive subject and you both tend to blow up at each other when you talk about it, maybe it's time to take a pause from the in-person conversation and do what all the kids do today. Why don't you speak through text? Why? Because when you're texting, you have some time to actually think before you respond. You don't have to just say whatever comes to your mind as you would in person. And it's also removed because tonality is a bit vague, and you can, maybe text each other instead of, yelling at each other in the face. And I'm not saying make these texts brutal, but at least have the conversation as open-ended, something like, hey, son, like for example, my dad would write to me because him and I always fight. He would write me these long emails, back in the day because the emails were bigger than texting. And we would talk through that, and then once we've resolved our conflict there, we would then sit down and actually have a better conversation. You can do the same thing here with this. You can tell your kid how it actually makes you feel, how it genuinely makes you feel, not by making them feel shitty, but by telling them your perspective. Like, hey son, when I was your age, weed was really a bad thing. It was told to us that it's really terrible for you and that it will cause your brain to rot. And I can't believe that after all these years, I catch you doing it. It just makes me feel like a failed parent. So what can I do to help you? Because it's not like I hate you or anything. I just don't know how to talk to you about this. So I'm hoping that maybe if I text you, we can make more progress. So ultimately, it's you opening up and sharing your vulnerability. How do you expect someone else to be vulnerable with you if you're going to be very closed off to them? So you want to start this conversation with text, and you can also maybe if listening to this video changes some thought process, do it in person too, right? Have the open-ended conversation in person. Now here's a really good example. Your son or daughter, if they're consuming weed, chances are they know more about it than you do, okay? Because they're clearly in the know of what's happening in the world. And if you're a parent who's never smoked weed, who's never done anything bad, or maybe you have, maybe 20 years ago you smoked some weed back in the day and you don't understand what the hype is about. Why are these kids trying to get high all day? Maybe it's time for you to put your learning hat on and come to your child with an open-minded approach and be like, hey, can you explain to me what it is that you're consuming? Do this, sit down with them and have a chat. Be like, hey son, I'm very curious, since you seem to know more about weed than I do, is there any chance that you can give me a little bit of an understanding on what is what? Because I really don't know. When I grew up, weed was just something that grew in someone's backyard, or it was smuggled from Mexico or whatever. And now I see these dispensaries are everywhere and I see all these people are smoking. I'm really not sure what it's all about. Do you mind telling me more about it? And maybe that's an approach that you can take to see and open up that dialogue in a much different way, right? And if you don't know where to go because you've had all these fights about it, you can maybe even admit, listen, son, I'm tired of fighting with you about this. I'm trying to change my outlook on things, and I want you to help me by telling me more about how this works. And maybe as a parent, what you could do ahead of time is do a little bit of research so that you know what kind of questions to ask. For example, there are many different ways of consuming weed. So for example, if your son or daughter is using a vape pen and you don't quite understand what that's about, if you can quickly look up how vape pens are made, and you can sit down your son or daughter and be like, hey, so when I grew up, weed used to grow on a plant and people used to roll up joints and that's how they would get high. But now I see you and all your friends, you have these little batteries and these pins and they're full of this goo. Can you tell me more about that? What that's going to do is it's going to give that kid the opportunity to share what he understands and how much he actually knows. And don't come at it with a judgmental attitude, but listen very carefully. oh, this is just oil, Ma. It's just THC, and it's just like extracted and put into this cartridge. Well, maybe as a parent, then you can ask the next question. Hey, so where is it that you get this? Oh, I get it from my friend. Okay, well, is he getting it from somewhere else? Yeah, he's got a guy that like gets it for him. He's like, okay, so how much do you pay for this? Oh, pay like $35. Oh, well, that's not bad. But I'm wondering, if it's that cheap, how can you know that it's actually good? Because here's what I don't want is, I don't want you to be getting any other chemicals that are bad for you added into this product and you not knowing. Because when you're looking at the oil, how do you know it's any good? Like, at least I remember when you had bud, you could kind of look at the plant, right? But here it's totally removed. What you're doing with that is you're not trying to like directly preach to them, but you're getting them to think a bit more logically. It's like, hey, Billy, if you're getting this for $35 from your friend's guy, I wonder what he's selling it to your friend for. And if your friend is then selling this for a profit, then this must be really, really cheap. And generally speaking, when something is that cheap, it's usually not the highest quality stuff. And my concern as your parent is that if you're going to do this, I would want you to not get something that's terrible for you. And you can do the same thing with like edibles, right? Or like, oh, you're making brownies. Like, I remember back in the day, we would make brownies and we would take some butter and that's how we would cook the brownies. Or how about this edible that you're getting from some stranger? How do you know what they're putting in there? They're putting distillate in there? You're telling me they're putting some oils in there? How is that oil made? Just being very curious, right? You'll be surprised at how much easier it is to break through to your child when you're coming at it from an open-ended, curious approach. And you can always, throw in your parenting wisdom, but you're doing it in a way where you're starting to meet them where they're at, rather than being an authoritative figure, acting like you know better and you know everything. They're already not going to listen to you. That's why they're listening to someone like me. I've been hearing from lots and lots of kids, many of them are yours, that are finding me on the internet because I put content out about how many of you are underage and you're smoking too much weed, but you're still very anxious, you're depressed and nervous all the time, and you don't know what you want to do with your life, but you have found this weed habit and now you don't know how to quit. Many of them reach out to me and they tell me that they can't talk to their parents about this because their parents just don't get it. They're too authoritative. They're just not on the same page with them. So they're coming to me, a person on the internet, to talk about their pain. And I'm more than happy to help them, but I want to help you, the parent, actually do this on your own, because it's your child, it's your love. You put so much into making this kid, survive in this world. So I want to give you some help. I want to arm you with the right tools and the techniques that maybe you can try if everything else that you've tried isn't working. And by that, I mean, you really got to come at it with an open-minded approach, really trying to learn from them, because they definitely know something that you don't, okay? And you want to see what that is. And then you can maybe logically walk them through some of these steps. Where exactly are you getting this from? How about how do you know that you're not getting something bad? Have you ever thought about that? How much money do you think you're spending on this? Things like that. I'll tell you a story. So when I first started smoking weed, thankfully, I was a very good kid. I didn't really do any drugs in school, and I got out of college. I did my degree. I competed in bodybuilding. Long story short, once I got out and I started working, I moved out of my house. I started making six figures. I was doing well. I started living far away from my family. And during that phase, I ended up developing a lot of anxiety and a ton of stress, right? Because I was making a lot of money for my age, but I didn't really know how to cope with life because I never really lived on my own. And now I'm living, miles away, hundreds of miles away from home, and I'm not around my parents as I always grew up around them, and I was very stressed out. And one of the things that was really popular at the time was weed. This was in San Francisco, so it was a very hot culture where there were dispensaries everywhere. And I remember like working in San Francisco in the city, walking around and seeing them all over the place. So I said, yeah, fuck it, why not? One of my friends recommended like, hey, this is really good for stress relief, much better than drinking. So I started occasionally smoking weed, and I found that it was actually very relaxing for me. It did help me cope with my stress and anxiety at a time. And then of course, my habits in general, I'm a person that can take things too far, okay? That's partly why I'm very successful with whatever I do, and it's also a detriment. It's also why I have problems that I've had in my life too. So it's a double-edged sword. It's the same thing I did with weed. I started as an infrequent user to a daily user to like an all-time user, to the point where I'm like abusing weed, using it all the time. And not only that, I'm actually like growing weed on my own because I like it so much. And of course, as a parent, my mom and dad are like, the fuck is going on with our son? Like, he's such a good kid. How did he come down to this rabbit hole? And it was fast. Like, I had only been out of the house for a couple of years, and here I am, like in this deep ass ditch. And my parents are just shocked, right? My parents are immigrants too, so you're like, what the fuck is going on with this kid? But I have to give it to them, for all the struggles that we've gone through. One of the things that I remember my dad did when he found out that I was doing it so regularly, that when I would go home, I would sneak around my weed. And if you know anything about weed, right, you know your son or daughter is smoking weed, it stinks. Even those vape pens have a smell, right? And you can see that your kid is high. So whenever my parents would like catch me after I'd gone outside and gotten high and come back in, you know, after some time, my dad was like, listen, son, I know you're doing this. Why don't you just sit in the front of the house like a normal person? It's your house, and just smoke outside. Like, you don't need to go run and hide about it. He didn't say anything more to me. And I was just like, what the fuck? Like, why? What? Okay. So I didn't think anything of it. I just started, whenever I'd be home and I'm going to smoke my weed, I would just sit outside in the patio and smoke. And a couple of times my dad would come and sit outside with me. He wasn't like going to smoke with me, but he would just sit and talk with me. And we had some good conversations when I was nice and relaxed, which is, again, an approach you can take. Maybe as painful as it is, maybe you should let your son, and I explained to him, because I was, you know, making good money. I was always buying like the really high quality weed. I would show him like, here, Dad, this is like what a sativa looks like. This is what an indica looks like. See, you can see the bud is kind of different. And then like, here's what the vape pens look like. This is what oils are like. They extract them this way and they're highly concentrated. So you only need a little bit. And then they make edibles, they make creams. At one point, I remember I even showed my dad like some homemade cream that a friend of mine made for pain. And I really got to tell him more and more about the shit that I learned. And it opened up the conversation. He got very curious about it. Like, he wasn't like, man, first off, he couldn't really say, son, don't do this, or you're like kicked out of the house, because I didn't live at home, right? So my parents didn't have that same luxury. You know, they still love me. I'm still their child, even though I'm like in my mid-20s. They still want to help me. But this is an approach that my parents took, and I'm sharing it back with you. My dad really just tried to like learn about what it is I do and why. So he would ask me about like, well, how often do you do this? So I'm like, oh, you know, I usually smoke like every 2 hours. Like, well, that can get kind of expensive. He's like, yeah, Dad, but that's why I use this dry herb vaporizer, because I only have to use a small amount. And so Dad's like, well, where are you buying this from? Like, are you going to like a reputable store? And at that time, I wasn't. I was actually staying away from dispensaries because they were charging so much in tax. I would end up getting it from like people that I knew, like street folks, right? Shit like this, where you kind of don't really know what you're getting, but you're getting like buying an ounce at a time or whatever. And I'm like, okay, well, he's like, I'd really prefer if you got stuff that was, you know, better quality and somewhat regulated. You know, it's okay if you have to pay the tax. It's funny, my dad even offered, he's like, dude, I'll pay for you to get like better quality stuff if that's something that you're concerned about. I'm like, what? You're gonna pay for my weed? Like, this was like mind fucking, right? Like reverse psychology at its finest. And I'm telling you all this because maybe you could do some of this with your kid, right? Like, offer to pay for it, offer to buy them the nicest stuff, and be like, damn, what is up with mom today? Like, yo, is she getting high with my shit? How is she so open-minded about all this? And over time, what it did, it really diffused this taboo subject that we couldn't talk about, that I didn't feel comfortable sharing with my parents because I knew it would hurt them. We were able to have this discussion. Same thing with my mom. I tell my mom everything. And I remember I told her way back, like, Ma, I started smoking weed. I'm so stressed out. I'm anxious all the time. And this seems to help me. And at that time, she's like, son, I hear you. Like, I know you're living alone. You're working hard and it's tough. So like, okay, I understand. Both of them didn't know that I was abusing weed after some time, right? That I was doing it so often that it was actually starting to ruin my health, you know? And then one of the things that my mom would ask me, you know, because she would see me after I'd gotten high, and if I'm at home, I'd be going into our cabinet full of all the junk food and I'd be munching on all of it, right? I'd eat like a whole bag of chips at night, a lot of cookies and shit. And my mom's like, bro, no, she didn't say bro, but she's like, son, you work out so hard. You know, you used to be a competitive bodybuilder. Like, you love your health, you care about it, and I know you smoke weed, but every time you get high, you get these crazy munchies. Like, how do you feel about all this weight that you're gaining, all this effort that you're putting in, and you're just basically throwing it out the window every night? I was like, fuck, Ma, you're right. Like, it was one of those things where like I knew it, but unless somebody called it out to me, like I didn't even like look to think of it as a big deal. Like, it doesn't matter if you do this like once in a while, but if this becomes a habit, a year, 2 years, 3 years later, you're going to be really obese. And I actually found myself getting a lot heavier in the several years after I started smoking weed, because of course food tastes better when you're high. That's why you have munchies, and that's why you go and overindulge. And for a kid, for someone that's really young who doesn't have good discipline or habits or their life put together, you can see how this problem is much worse. So something that worked for me as someone that was in mid-20s and already successful, that my parents did with me, I'm hoping they will help you catch your kid much earlier on in life and set them back on course. Because as a parent, it's your responsibility to get this kid back on track. It's not your responsibility to only punish them, but you got to help them get back on track. If they're not okay with you talking to them about this, you got to find a way, you know? I mean, it's totally cool. They can keep coming to me, but ultimately, I'm not their parent. I can only tell them some things and they may or may not do them. I'm not there to check in on them all the time to see if they're actually going through with the advice that they got from me, whether it's to meditate, whether it's to write down their negative emotions, whether it's to notice their triggers as to whenever they do get high, so maybe you do some of this questioning with your kid and be like, hey, listen, son, I noticed that weed is the only thing that makes you feel happy inside. Can you tell me what it is that you're going through? Can you tell me what you feel that makes you want to get high? I'm just very curious to know, son. Like, I want to know what's happening with you. Now, keep in mind, this might not work right away, okay? It's not like you listen to this video and now all of a sudden you are going to go execute and it's going to work perfectly. It's probably not going to work right away. So be prepared for that, but just don't give up, right? It's your son, it's your daughter, and it's up to you to get them back on track. So with all that said, I really want you and your kids to have a great relationship. And I say this as a fellow parent now. I have a baby and he's going to grow up and I'm going to have more kids. And I do worry about the world that they're growing up in, where weed is going to become so much more available than it even is today. And it's very available today, especially since I'm living in California. I'm going to be able to have this conversation with them. And I'm someone that still consumes weed. Now, I don't get high all day every day like I used to, but I still like it. But I know the pitfalls of my own behavior, and I have my own wife and my parents holding me accountable to doing the things that I'm responsible for to make sure that I am not falling off into my old ways. And this is just one of those things that I really felt deep from my heart is a reason I had to share with you. So hopefully you didn't get misleaded by the title and you actually found it helpful. And if any of you, whether you're a parent or a child watching this, if you're a child watching this, send it to your parent. If you're a young adult that's like, hey man, I think my mom needs to hear this, send it to them. And if you're a parent watching this, I really want to encourage you to try the techniques that I'm talking about here by meeting your kid where they're at, rather than trying to be the authority on this topic, because chances are your child knows a bit more about this than you do, and you do want to hear them out. And then you can use your, parenting techniques of asking open-ended questions and throwing in your logical thoughts there and getting them to navigate their thought process a bit better. Because here's the thing, when you're really in the deep trenches of weed, you find everything and anyone that has anything to say about weed that's negative, and you completely shut it out because you're like, you don't know because you don't get high. You have no clue what you're talking about. So if you want to avoid that, you got to come at it with the approach of, I really don't know anything about this, son. Will you help me understand? I really want to know more. Can you show me what it is that you do? Can you show me how it works? Can you show me what's the difference between this bud and this vape pen and that edible and this and that, like whatever it is that they're doing. Like, can you show me why you use that glass tube? Can you show me why, like, how do you roll a joint? How did you get so good at doing this, son? Whatever it is, right? Like, get curious and you'll be surprised at where this conversation can go. And if you've tried everything else, you got nothing to lose. Try this too. And if it doesn't work, at least you say you tried, right? So let me know what you guys think of this video. Put your thoughts in the comments. I really, really genuinely hope this helps one person out. That'll make me super happy. And happy 420.